Hi everyone, I'm Shweta Rohela. I lead the Azure Resiliency and Observability for Tech Strategy Worldwide. For our customer success organization, been helping develop solutions to help you proactively build more resilient foundation. Some of these solutions we will cover today. I'm joined by Charlie and Seth today. Over to you, Charlie.
I'm Charlie. I'm a program manager. I'm responsible for developing and landing the technical strategy for the customer success unit organization within Microsoft. We do that around two main customer scenarios. One is securing and governing hybrid environments with Azure Arc. And the second one, enabling at scale secure and resilient Azure deployments using infra as code with Azure Verified Modules.
Hi, everyone. I'm Saif Bassam. I'm a cloud solution architect in the tech strategy team. And I'm a core maintainer in some of the solutions you're going to see today, like Azure Landing Zones and Azure Verified Modules. Back to you, Shweta.
All right, let's kick off our session with a simple yet effective agenda that aligns perfectly with our strategy. We'll begin by exploring the foundational steps to building a resilient cloud environment. If you're not already on this journey, we'll discuss how to get started. And for those of you well underway, we'll dwell into strategies for maintaining and enhancing your existing resilience posture. Throughout this session, we will highlight key tools and best practices that you can leverage today to accelerate your resilience journey. There is an economic impact report produced by a third party for resiliency. This report is part of ROI calculation and will be available to you on the site. Based on their analysis, it was found out that 85% of the organizations will embrace a cloud-first approach. And that's when we have 40% of the servers have suffered one of the server outages. And if a customer is facing an unplanned outage, the mission critical workload is impacted, it is the worst. Cost is not high, not just in terms of the dollar loss or the revenue loss. Customer trust is lost, and there are so many other type of losses. This deep analysis also found out that per year, about 74% of these mission critical workload outages could have been avoided if they had followed well-architected framework guidance. 74% is a big number. And resiliency, we want you to think it's very similar to building a resilient and strong house that can withstand any weather condition. We want to help you do that. And let's understand how building a resilient architecture is a shared responsibility. It's Microsoft's responsibility to give you a strong foundation. And Microsoft have been investing a lot on reliable foundation that's resilient by design. We monitor to ensure availability, and we continue to invest on improving this resilient foundation like change management and operations. There are improvements happening every month. And on top of reliable foundation, we have built resiliency features that customer and partners can take advantage of, like multi-zone, multi-region deployments, BCDR solutions that you should all be taking advantage of. At the top of the diagram, I have workload architecture that customer and partner are responsible for. Microsoft does provide a lot of feature to help you withstand outages in some of the cases. If you are impacted, we help you recover from the disaster. And we help you make your application more highly available. Always test your backup and recovery plan to make sure it works as expected within your RPO and RTO limit. With that, let's talk about some of the solutions that help you in your resiliency journey.
Thank you, Shweta. So you just talked about how some of the core Azure capabilities are built into the platform to ensure availability, how optional Azure features improve resiliency. But for each of our Azure users, it also comes down to adopting a resiliency posture to create a practice around it. So we started an initiative at Microsoft called the Proactive Resiliency Framework to help with that. And it comes down to those three things. How do you start resilient? Because clearly, if you start resilient, that's the easiest path for the long run. But if you're not, or if you don't even know if you are or are not resilient, how do you get resilient? Okay. And then in the long run, how do you stay resilient? So for each of those, we created some tools and more acronyms, as you can see, LZ, AVM, and so on. But don't worry, we're going to talk about all of this. And I will now start with Azure Landing Zone. Most journeys into the cloud start with the Cloud Adoption Framework. And you're probably familiar with it by now. It's been a few years. It's an industry term. It's not even, just about Azure or Microsoft. And very often now those journeys, they start with Azure Landing Zone. ALZ, Azure Landing Zone, is that foundation that puts you on an architectural path for long-term success in Azure. Landing zone environments, they follow key design principles to accommodate all application portfolios, to enable application migration, modernization, innovation at scale. And the landing zones, they are widely adopted now. We see like a couple thousand deployments every quarter. To give you a bit more details, an ALZ uses subscriptions to isolate and scale application resources and platform resources. So subscription for application resources are called application landing zones, and subscription for platform resources are called platform landing zones. We also have accelerators, which are infrastructure as code implementations that help you deploy an ALZ correctly. And for instance, to help you start resilient. The team behind ALZ have been working closely with engineering from day one. It's a close partnership between the Microsoft field teams, who interact and hear from customers on a day-to-day basis what they need most, and our engineering teams who are developing the platform. Now, back to resiliency. ALZ puts all the best practices in place for you on day one. So you literally start resilient if you use Azure Landing Zones. For example, we put multi-region support in there. So if you deploy to one region, but by default, if you deploy through Azure Landing Zone, you get that second region. And if you've been using Landing Zone for a while, there's a brownfield guidance there for you for how to get that second region in there. And we do update this regularly on a quarterly basis, actually, because, all the different engineering teams at Microsoft, they update their services and capabilities constantly, as you know. So we need to keep that in sync with them so you can have the latest and greatest guidance as well as implementation. Another example is that we make sure everything is zonal redundant, right? So any services that we deploy in ALZ, about 13 services for the foundational pieces, we make sure that they're using zones. So if you've got multi-region support, you've got zonal redundant right out of the box, right on day one. And that helps you start resilient. Let's now illustrate what I just talked about. So how ALZ helps you start resilient with a demo. My colleague Saif created a demo around the following story. So we have the company Contoso. It's a global retailer, multi-geo locations across the world. They want to move to Azure to scale their business. They want to provide the best possible service to their customers. And for that, they want to start on Azure based on the best practices, accumulated by many people across various aspects, such as security, resiliency, governance, operation excellence. They need to have scalable, streamlined cloud operations. But one of their key requirements is that their platform and their applications, they must be highly resilient. Saif, can you walk us through the first part of your demo?
Sure, Charlie. So in the first part of the demo, we're going to explore why Contoso is relying on Azure Landing Zone. We're going to also see the different option where Contoso can deploy the platform landing zone and which option that they've chosen. We're going to also see in the Azure portal after the deployment, what kind of Azure resources have been deployed in Contoso's environment. And lastly, we're going to take a couple of examples about the different controls and security best practices that the platform landing zone has enforced in Contoso's environment. Contoso wants to start their cloud journey on Azure the right way, aligning with best practices across security, resiliency, governance, and operational excellence. Since they have presence across multiple geographical locations, they want to implement those best practices at scale. So they decided to deploy the Azure Platform Landing Zone as the cornerstone of their global cloud operations. Before deploying the Azure Platform Landing Zone, let's look at how Contoso's environment looks like in Azure. So if we go to Azure, we can see that they have no subscriptions, they have no management group hierarchy. And as part of deploying Azure Landing Zones, they need to prepare a couple of subscriptions to be used by the platform resources. There are three options to deploy the platform landing zone. Contoso could use the portal, or bicep or Terraform. It's always recommended to use either bicep or Terraform because those are the methods that provide the most flexibility and a streamlined way to maintain the landing zone going forward. For the sake of this demo, Contoso are going to use the portal accelerator for simplicity. Going through the portal deployment, Contoso can customize some aspects of how the landing zone is going to look like the management group prefix. They can deploy in a secondary region to serve their clients in the different geographical locations. They also get to configure some governance and monitoring capabilities of the landing zone, like the log analytics workspace, diagnostic settings, deployment of Microsoft Sentinel, and also they can deploy some of the management capabilities in Azure like change tracking, update manager, and VM insights. They're also able to deploy and enable some of the Microsoft Defender for Cloud plans to protect their Azure resources being deployed. Next, they're able to deploy the Azure Monitor baseline alerts. This is something that we're going to cover later on. So I'm not going to change the defaults, and I'm going to allow to deploy all of the best practices in terms of alerts for their platform landing zone. Next, with the network topology, landing zone has two types of topologies, hub and spoke and virtual WAN. Contoso are going to use hub and spoke with Azure Firewall. So here they're going to be able to configure the address space for both of the hubs in the two regions that they're deploying into. They can enable some capabilities like DDoS protection, creation of private DNS zones, deploying VPN gateways or express route gateways, and they can also select whether they're deployed in availability zones for better resiliency. Also, they get to choose the SKU of the Azure Firewall that they would like to deploy. Next, in terms of identity, they choose the subscription that is going to hold the identity resources like domain controllers, and they also get to choose the different security and governance controls that needs to be enforced on those subscriptions, like preventing inbound management ports from the internet, subnets be associated with network security groups, etc., etc. And then they get to choose the configuration for the landing zones. This is where the applications and workloads are going to live. So here you're going to find a lot of different Azure service specific configuration enabled via Azure policy that can help protect existing and new workloads being onboarded to the landing zones. Contoso also might have some workload specific compliance requirements like customer managed keys or some security controls for their AI services. So they can also enable this from here and select the subscription that match those type of workloads. And finally, if they are following any regulatory compliance standard, they also get to enable this from the wizard. So if they're following CIS, ISO, PCI, FedRAMP, they can select this and select where they want those baselines to be applied. Once they've configured the landing zone, the next step is to deploy the landing zone. We're going to wait until this gets deployed, and then we're going to come back and see how does this look like in the Azure portal. After the landing zone deployment has completed, we can go back to the Azure portal and we can see that there is a new management group hierarchy. And below it, we can see the Azure landing zone hierarchy being deployed with the subscriptions being moved to the appropriate management groups. To give you an example of what was deployed, if I go to the connectivity subscription, we're going to be able to see two hubs in terms of networking that are deployed across two regions. And within each hub, you can see the Azure Firewall, you can see the VPN gateway and the route table, and some supporting resources that allow this to be a centralized hub for the platform landing zone. Similarly, we're going to look at the other region and we're going to see the same set of resources being deployed in the other region for better resiliency. Another thing that we've talked about as we're deploying the landing zone is that there are lots of policies to make sure that application teams are following and are complying with Contoso's controls and security measures. To demonstrate that, I'm going to try to create a key vault as an application owner, and I'm going to just use the defaults which enable the public access of the key vault, which obviously isn't a best practice. This key vault is deployed in a subscription beneath the Azure landing zone hierarchy. And as this gets validated, I'm going to get an error saying that key vault should disable public network access. And this is being applied through one of the Azure policy initiatives that are enforced by the platform landing zones. So I'm protecting my workloads from falling out of compliance and causing security risks being deployed into Azure. Another thing that the policies in the platform landing zone help Contoso do is make sure that their workloads are resilient. So if we go into one of the landing zone subscriptions and go to policy, we're going to see the compliance of all of the policies enforced by the landing zone on the resources available. So I can see a lot of policies and I can see the compliance. This is very useful if I have existing workloads running in Azure. And as I move this to the landing zone hierarchy, I can immediately see the compliance of my resources. One of the very important policies is this one: resources should be zone resilient. This is an audit policy that is going to tell me if any of my resources are not following the resiliency best practices, for example, not being deployed into availability zones. So this is something that is going to help Contoso to start and also stay resilient as they grow in Azure. Back to you, Charlie.
Thank you, Saif. Great demo. Before I talk about the next part, I just wanted to quickly level set on the well-architected framework. It's also an industry term. It's made of 5 pillars. You probably know about those already. They all matter. But of course, here today, what we're really talking about is the pillar underneath reliability. Okay, and there is a lot of guidance in there to help you understand how do you configure those workloads that you're going to be running in Azure. What are some of the approaches you can take? What are the principles that you can follow? What are some of the best practices that have worked already? And what we're doing is codifying these best practices wherever we can. So that this is why you see here on the slide the red reliability pillar. We also highlighted the security one. Why? Because the next part I'm going to talk about is about Azure Verified Modules, is enabling you both equally on reliability and security. So let me move on and talk about Azure Verified Modules. We talked about starting resilient with Azure Landing Zones, which absolutely gets you to start resilient along with those accelerators. But we have something called Azure Verified Modules. Say you want to run some workloads. You need to deploy a bunch of infrastructure for it. And you want to do this with infrastructure as code, which is very common, right? We see a lot of customers today really adopting this DevOps practice. And over the past few years, there have been several projects in the community to help with infra as code. And some of those have been super helpful. But which one do you choose? Which one can you trust to be supported in the long term? That's why we started this initiative maybe 18 months ago, where we have built a library of modules called Azure Verified Modules. This initiative, we created it in partnership with Microsoft Bicep and Microsoft Terraform Engineering, and it has been adopted as the standard for infra as code across Microsoft. And as you can see on this slide, step by step outside of Microsoft. You can see by the numbers for the public, we made it available about a year ago, roughly. And we now have about 170 bicep modules in the library, about 90 on Terraform. We could reuse some of the existing bicep code. That's why we had a head start on bicep. And we see more than 500,000 deployments on a monthly basis across more than 2,000 customers. Now, those numbers were back in October, I think, but on a monthly basis, it's growing really fast. Now, to explain you more a little bit about those modules, each of those, they're like a composable building block that basically encapsulates the resources for a scenario or thing that you want to do. So if you want to deploy a VM, let's say, we wrap in that module all the various pieces that you need to have a successful VM deployment. That would be a resource module. That's what we call them. But, and you can see on the right of this slide, we have different types. We also have modules that deploy multiple resources, usually resource modules, by the way, and we call them pattern modules. And good candidates for pattern modules are those architectures that exist in the Azure Architecture Center, for instance, or the landing zone accelerators. Those are, some of our most demanded pattern modules. But these are not like any other infra as code modules. From day one, we decided on a few principles and define some specifications for these. In particular, we want to make sure that we have the well-architected framework defaults for reliability and security where it makes sense. From time to time, you cannot just make it a default. You really need the user, the customer, to choose. But then we make those parameters mandatory so that at least the user takes a conscious decision around reliability or security. This way, when you deploy a module, instead of you having to write the module yourself, go and look for the documentation and do all of these things, well, all of this work has been done for you. And last point, we keep them updated. Of course, we first make them available in public registry, so the bicep registry for bicep and the HashiCorp Terraform registry. But then these modules are durable modules that we maintain, update, verify with engineering. Before I hand over to Saif for the second part of his demo, I wanted to show you this slide to help clarify where AVM fits in the customer journey when it comes to Azure Landing Zone. As you can see on the slide, as you want to deploy workloads in your application landing zones, this is where the use of AVM, pattern modules, or yourself, you stitch together some resource modules exactly the way you need them. AVM will help you do that at scale, but in a secure and resilient way. Saif, over to you for the second part of your demo, where you will showcase AVM, I believe.
Thank you, Charlie. In the second part of the demo, we're going to look at the stage after Contoso has deployed their platform landing zone, where now they want to enable their application teams to start migrating or building new workloads into the cloud. So we're going to see the subscription vending process that Contoso's platform team has created to streamline how application teams can request and deploy landing zones into Contoso's environment. The HR team at Contoso is going to be the first team that is going to deploy applications into the landing zone. And they decided they're going to use Azure Verified Modules to deploy their Phoenix application into the landing zone. We're going to see how they're going to do this. And also, after this application has been deployed, we're going to see how they're going to simulate that there is a failure and outage in the Azure environment and see how their application is going to react and is resilient as promised by the Azure Verified Module best practices. After the platform landing zone has been deployed, the application teams at Contoso can start migrating or deploying new applications to Azure. The first application is an HR application named Project Phoenix. One of the design principles of Azure landing zones is subscription democratization, where application teams are granted subscriptions to host their workloads. This approach allows less friction, where the application teams get the autonomy they need to innovate on Azure, while still comply with Contoso's cloud governance and security controls. This is enforced using the Azure policies implemented by the platform landing zone. The cloud team at Contoso has created a process to allow application teams to request subscriptions using the subscription vending process, which is available as an Azure Verified Pattern module in both Bicep and Terraform. The application teams start by submitting a request with all of the requirements they need for the new subscription. After the request has been reviewed and approved by the platform team, a pipeline would run to deploy the subscription vending module, either in Bicep or Terraform, and create the subscription with all of the necessary configuration that they need. Let's see how this looks like in Contoso's environment. Now let's see how the application teams and Contoso can request a new subscription using the subscription vending process. It starts with filling a form that the platform team has created with some inputs around the subscription that needs to be created. So the project name is going to be Project Phoenix. This is the display name that the application team would like to have. So I'm going to provide HR Phoenix. And then the platform team requires an Enter ID group ID where the administrators for this workload are going to be members of. The app team also can request a virtual network to be deployed as part of the subscription, and they can provide the address space. They can also ask to have this network peer to the hub network in the platform landing zone. So if they need on-prem connectivity or security inspection through Azure Firewall, they can request that. But for the sake of this app, this is not needed. Once they submit the request, the platform team is going to review, approve this request. I'm going to simulate that this request has been approved. And automatically, there is a pipeline that is going to run in the background to take those inputs and then create a new subscription with all of the needed components. Let's look in the background to see how the subscription vending module looks like. As you can see, it's a very simple module. It's hosted in the public bicep repository. It's a pattern module, and it's called subvending. It takes a couple of parameters. So as you can see, I'm providing the subscription name from the input that I've got in the form. Also, the platform team chooses to put the subscription underneath the corp landing zone so that it gets the policies that are applied there. Also, they've enabled virtual network, and they're taking the input that the application team has taken and creating this with the right address space. They also can register resource providers and some preview features in the subscription. This is something that they can customize. And finally, they're also creating role assignments as part of creating the subscription to provide the Enter ID group that the HR team has provided to be a contributor on the subscription. Once this is complete, let's go to the Azure portal and see how this looks like. After the subscription vending pipeline has completed successfully, let's go to the Azure portal and see what got deployed. Looking at the platform landing zone hierarchy, underneath the corp management group, we can see that a new HR Phoenix subscription has indeed been created successfully. If we look at the resource groups for this subscription, we're able to see the resource group that we asked to be deployed as part of the virtual network creation. And we can see indeed the virtual network already deployed, and the address space is as we specified. We can also see the Phoenix project admin group is indeed assigned a contributor role on the subscription created. So that's how easy it is that the Contoso team at scale can create grant subscriptions and configure them for their application teams. After the application team has gotten the new subscription, the next step for them is to deploy the application to this new subscription. They already used bicep to create the infrastructure as code artifacts for this application, but they recently learned about Azure Verified Modules and decided to refactor their code to use it to gain the benefits of aligning to the well-architected framework with concepts like resilient by default and secure by default in their code. The application is a simple web app deployed on a virtual machine scale set behind an Azure load balancer. Let's see how their code looked like before and after being refactored using Azure Verified Modules. On the left side, we see the bicep code without using Azure Verified Modules. And we can see immediately that the code can be a little bit hard to read. We also see that we need to specify the availability zones to make sure that the scale set is spread across the zones in the region. If we look at the end of the code, we can see that we are creating an additional resource to create a role assignment on the virtual machine scale set, which can add more complexity to the readability of our code. Now let's bring the refactored code using Azure Verified Modules. So you can see here, I'm using the public bicep registry and using the Azure Verified module. And you can see immediately how more concise this code looks like. And if you notice also, there are no availability zones defined so that we can see the default behavior once we deploy this into the Azure portal. Also, to align with the original code, we need to create the same role assignment on the left. So with Azure Verified Modules, this is embedded in the module itself. So I don't need to create an additional resource. So what I will do is that using IntelliSense, I'm going to find that we already have role assignments within this resource. And I'm going to provide the principal ID, the role definition name, which I have as parameters, and the principal type to be user. And as you can see, it's more concise, it's available. Everything that the resource needs is already embedded in it. And you can see with IntelliSense, I'm barely writing any type of code. Now let's deploy this into the Azure portal and let's see how the application looks like. Now, if we look into the resource group for Project Phoenix, we can now see that the application is indeed deployed into the resource group successfully. Now let's look at the virtual machine scale set instances, and we can see that we have 3 instances, and each instance is deployed in a different availability zone. And if we browse to the application itself using the load balancer public IP address, we can see that the application every time is served from a different availability zone. This makes sure that if one of the zones goes down, the application is still available to the users. To make sure that the HR Phoenix application is resilient and the measure the application team has taken can withstand failures and outages, they have decided to perform an experiment using Chaos Studio in Azure to take down 2 availability zones and see how the application is going to react. So in Chaos Studio, they've created a new experiment from a template. They're going to choose availability zone down experiment. Then they're going to give it a name. Let's say zone down. Select the region. They need to grant the experiment the needed permissions to be able to shut down the virtual machine scale set. Then in the experiment steps, they're going to remove unneeded steps. And then they have to specify which resource they're going to target with this experiment, which is our virtual machine scale set, and select the zones that they're going to take down. So for example, I'm going to take zones 2 and zone 3. Then we're ready to create this experiment. And after this experiment has been created, let's go and see what is going to happen to the application. After the experiment has been created successfully, let's go to the experiment details, and we can see that the experiment is now running. So our virtual machine scale set should be stopping in the first 2 zones. So if I go to scale set and go to instances, and now back to you, Shweta.
Thank you, Seth. Let's dive into another critical aspect of resiliency, which is Get Resilient. For this Get Resilient section, I'll cover 2 solutions. One is APRL and another one is EMPA. Let's get started by acknowledging that building a resilient foundation is an ongoing journey. Charlie and Seth covered how solutions like Landing Zone, AVM can help you get started. But what if you haven't embarked on this journey? Or if your initial efforts were implemented some time ago and the cloud landscape is constantly evolving to ensure your Azure solutions remain resilient, it's crucial to continuously assess and adapt your strategy. Now imagine manually checking every Azure resource in a complex workload for potential issues or enhancements, which often requires large team of specialists, each with expertise in different areas like networking, compute, data and AI, apps innovation. It's a daunting task and time consuming and also prone to errors. Wouldn't it be great to have a solution that automates this process? That's what APRL, Azure Proactive Resiliency Library, does it for us. It's a curated catalog of resiliency recommendation for Azure environment specifically. Right now, we have 525 recommendations across 79 services and growing. We are still actively working every month to add new recommendation or making one or the other enhancements. On top of all these curated recommendations, we have automation scripts that run these resiliency recommendation checks against resources deployed in your workload, analyzes the output, and gives you an actionable report within few minutes. So you can think of April as your trusted advisor, offering expert insights and best practices to prevent potential issues and minimizing downtime. It really helps you improve uptime and reliability because it helps you identify potential issues before they lead to disruption, which then help you minimize downtime and data loss. For example, if you identify that your VMs are not multi-zonal, which means they're not resilient to zonal outage, you will need to plan to make your VMs multi-zonal, which by the way will require a short downtime for that VM, but it's better to have a planned outage for a known duration at a non-critical business hours than an unplanned outage with unknown duration and recovery time, and at a critical business time. That's going to be an absolute nightmare for the architects, CEOs, CTOs, and any of the stakeholders. So We need to keep that in mind. The outages will happen and will continue to happen. We need to have a more resilient architecture to recover from it. And April also helps you align with Azure well-architected framework. It helps you ensure you adheres to the industry standard guidelines. It minimizes the operational overhead because it automates many of the tasks associated with identifying resiliency risk, saving your time and effort. So I encourage all of our customers and partners start implementing the recommendation that come out of April today to build more resilient Azure workload. And remember, resiliency is a continuous journey. It's not a one-time event. By embracing April, you are taking a proactive step towards ensuring the success and reliability of your Azure applications. So highly encourage you to go and adopt this solution. All right, let's see a quick demo of Azure Proactive Resilience Library. So it's more real to you. Let's see some of the recommendations we have. For example, network, we have application gateway. At the top of the page, we have a table with the recommendation. What is the impact of this recommendation? What category it lies under? Is it scalability, monitoring, alerting, high availability, or disaster recovery? And when I click on any of the recommendation, it takes me to a more detailed view to help me understand the recommendation better. Better description, it has links for me to learn further. And here we also have Azure Resource Graph query that you can copy and paste into your portal. Let's do that quickly for this example. Here I'm at the portal and I have opened Azure Resource Graph Explorer. I'm going to paste that ARG query, quickly run it within few seconds, less than a second maybe. It's showing me that I have two application gateways. Here are the names of these that looks like are not zone resilient. So that's a quick way to check if you're following a specific recommendation or not on the resources you have deployed in your Azure. Coming back to the Azure Resource Graph, we have this query for lots of the recommendation on the portal, but running these queries individually, going to the portal, copy pasting and running, it's going to be time consuming and will be hard to compile the final results and then create a priority. So for that, we have built some tooling for you. And this tooling can be broken down into 3 different sections. And we have PowerShell script for each of these sections. First one is the collector script that runs the APRL recommendation for which we have the ARG queries against deployed resources. Again, want to keep in mind, we have all these recommendations, but not for all of these recommendations. We have an ARG query that can be automated. For some of these, you have to run manually checks. But for the ones we have the ARG query, you can leverage this tool to collect the data, not just for the recommendation, it also collects the data for recent Azure Service Health retirements, any outages notification, and the configuration of Azure Service Health alerts, because all of these are relevant to the reliability recommendation and your next steps. Here we have very good guidance on how to leverage this collector script. We have the overview, how to run it, any of the prerequisite we have, some of the examples here as well. You need to have PowerShell 7, Git, and these PowerShell modules already installed on your local machine or your cloud shell. You need to download our first Vora collector PS1, and here's a very good documentation. Let's get started with the demo. I like to do this in Visual Studio. First, I will invoke web request to download the script as mentioned in the documentation. I have done it here. And here you can see this takes different parameters. It takes tenant ID, it can take subscription ID or resource group, depending on how you have deployed your critical workload. Some of the customer have one subscription critical workload is deployed, but some customer have few of the resource group in one subscription have the workload one, and other resource group in the same subscription have another workload. So however you have deployed it, there's very flexible ways to passing those parameters, or you can do so in the config file like I have done here. Here I have passed the tenant ID, subscription IDs that I want to run the recommendation check against, all the resources under this subscription will be checked. And then I want in another subscription, I want just this resource group to be included. So all these I can pass into my file and say I'm passing config files, and my file name is config.txt, and I hit enter. It will take a few minutes to run. So that took about 3 minutes to run, and it has produced a JSON file which has information about the impacted resources, all my recommendations that are still active from advisor, my recent outages I have had, any of the service retirements that are coming, support requests, and service health alerts, etc. So now I'll go ahead and invoke a web request and download the second file. Now I have the file. What I'll do is I'll run it and pass the JSON file that's just produced. And run it. It's going to take less than a minute to run, and it collects the data from the JSON file and the April library itself, and it gives us an Excel sheet with an action plan, which has critical information in its tabs. So the second step took less than a minute to run, and it has produced an Excel sheet which has different tabs in it. First tab is the recommendation. It has a list of recommendations. It has everything, even though the recommendation we are already following. So if you select here, yes, sometimes you see if we have already following the recommendation, you will see a yes here. In this case, it's a no. And here in the next tab, we see impacted resources. So if you have 10 different virtual networks and I have 10 different recommendations for that, it will check for all those 10 recommendations for all the 10 resources and give you a list where we need to take action. It gives you the impact as well. You can modify the priority on this. It can be that, in the log file, you are using your disk for logging. And the recommendation comes out, upgrade your disk to ultra disk or premium disk. But if you're just using for logging, it's not critical for you. So though the impact can be high, you can assign a low priority to this because it's not just a priority for you. Logging is not critical for you. And then it also has some of the recommendation which could not be automated through the script. And it has a comment on this. This need to be checked manually, which is other out of scope. And there are some other out of scope recommendations as well for some of the resources that are not very critical. For example, DCR, data collection rules. It's not in scope for this. And here you see some of the summary of the recent outages. So you can compare, here is the impact resources. I have severe outage in my VMs, and here are the recommendation for these VMs I can take to minimize the impact in future. And here are the service retirements. We also have the summarized view at the end where you see how many high, medium, or low recommendation I have by each resource type, or a pivot view of how many high availability recommendation I need to take action on. Maybe for the disaster recovery, I have 6 high impact recommendations, 6 medium, and 4 low impact recommendations. So that gives you a really good summary within few minutes of time, which otherwise would take lots of time. For the last script, I will invoke a web request to download the script as well as some of the templates. And all this is already covered in the documentation. And then last step is you run the script here, which again gonna take less than a minute to run. At the end, it will give us a Word doc and a PowerPoint summary of all these recommendations. It also includes some of the critical aspects like, hey, how is your expert routes resiliency? Is service health alerts are in place? How does your zonal resiliency looks like? What is your zonal posture? So it gives you a summary of that. It also gives you areas which need to be updated manually. So last script has run and it took about a minute as well. And it has produced 2 files. One is the PowerPoint presentation and another one is the Word doc. Let's see how the Word doc and how these files look like. Here I have the Word doc, which has all these beneficial sections on executive summary. And then, like I said, what are the baseline resiliency metrics and some of the other critical insights and summary like zonal and regional resiliency, expressed out resiliency, etc. And then also a summary of all these recommendations. Like here, I have a summary of what is the recommendation, what is the number of impact resources, and what is the resource type for this. So you can prioritize this. Here, in some of the parts, you will require to make some of the changes manually. It's categorized by impact. Like I again said, you might have to change the priority on this and plan to implement these recommendations accordingly. Here, I also got the PowerPoint presentation, again with an awesome summary. It shows at the top if the slide was automatically modified, it needs a review or not. And in some cases, it requires you to update some of the slides manually. So all that is done within few minutes of time, which otherwise will take you tremendous amount of time, and there might be some errors. Right, let's talk about another critical solution, which is monitoring and alerting for reliable and resilient Azure environment. Think of this as having early warning system for your cloud infrastructure. By proactively monitoring your resources, you can identify and address potential issues before they impact your application. And you can't fix things. If you don't see the issues, you can't fix them. It helps you with the early detection of issues. For example, imagine your Azure resources as a complex machine. Monitoring tools such as sensor constantly collecting data on their health is crucial. And by setting alerts, you can be instantly notified of any anomalies such as spike in CPU usage, a dip in network connectivity, or a security breach. And it helps you also reduce the downtime. It can be costly for any business. With monitoring and alerting, you can quickly identify and resolve issue, minimizing downtime, and make sure your application remain accessible and performant to the users. You also optimize resource. Monitoring provides valuable insights into your resource consumption pattern, if you need to scale up or scale down or right size your infrastructure, and helps you optimize cost as well. Also, monitoring helps you stay compliant with security. It's paramount to the cloud. Security is paramount to the cloud. By monitoring security logs and detecting suspicious activities, you can proactively address security threats and ensure compliance with industry standards. It helps you with capacity planning as well. Planning for future is crucial. By analyzing historical usage patterns, you can forecast future resource needs and proactively scale your resources to avoid performance bottlenecks and ensure smooth user experience. All in all, monitoring and alerting is an indispensable tool for building a resilient and reliable Azure environment. But there are some challenges with monitoring and alerting. How do you know what rules to set up? On what metric you want to leverage? What the threshold value should be? And how do you scale this for all the resources you have in your workload? We want to help you to stay ahead and be proactively notified if things start to not look good. And when networks start to begin throttled, the VM needs to be scaled up. So that's why we built AMBA, which is Azure Monitor Baseline Alerts. It's a GitHub repo. It's a powerful tool that can significantly simplify your Azure monitoring. It's a central repository with over 500 alerts definition today and growing across 67 Azure services. Think of it as a treasure for expert-approved alert configuration. And it's tailored for different workload patterns as well. The alerts rule are available by resource type and by workload like SAP, AVM, AVS, etc. And all these configuration are complete with ARM and bicep templates, so that can help you streamline the deployments. AMBA is already being leveraged by over 160 customers. That's already demonstrates the value of improving observability and reducing any operational overhead. When we were building AMBA, we kept some of the key goals in mind because there are some challenges, right? If we want to keep usable for whether you are a seasoned developer or someone who's starting just now, starting on your Azure journey now, we wanted to have the lower barrier to entry so we can enable everyone to get faster time to value, which is quickly implement and benefit from effective alerting, and also improve reliability. So all the alerts are tailored more for the reliability posture, where you proactively identify and address potential issues before they impact your applications. With that, I want to share some of the upcoming enhancements to AMBA, starting with AMBA Gap Analysis Workbook. This powerful tool will provide you with a detailed analysis of your current alert coverage against the guidance we have in AMBA. It will clearly identify which resources in your workbook already have alerts deployed, which are green. It has adequate monitoring. For example, in this slide, we see that for public IP address resources, I don't have very good coverage. And by understanding these gaps, you can proactively address any potential blind spots in your monitoring strategies and take steps to mitigate these risks. Now let's see a quick demo for the EMBA. Saif gonna cover a few of the features of the EMBA today.
The HR team at Contoso wants to make sure that their application stays resilient and highly available as it scales and grows on Azure. So they've decided to use Azure Monitor Baseline Alerts to deploy critical alerts so that they are notified if the health of one of their application components is degraded, and also to be notified if there are any Azure Service Health incidents. So going to the Azure Monitor Baseline Alert website, you can see more information around what it offers. And if they go to the Azure resources, they're going to see all of the Azure resources that have alerts that can be deployed using this solution. For virtual machine scale set, they're going to select the VM availability metric. They can see how the metric is configured, and they can also see the different deployment options to deploy this into their Azure environment. For this demo, they decided to deploy a service health incident alert. So if we go to service health incident alert, we're going to deploy it directly using the Azure portal. This alert is going to notify them if there are any outages in Azure so that they can proactively take an action to make sure that their application stays resilient. We're going to select the same resource group, give it a name, and make sure it's enabled, and then create this alert. Once this is created, let's look at how it looks like and how to simulate this kind of alert.
All right, let's start with stay resilient, part of your resiliency journey. So far, we have covered you can leverage tools like ALZ, AVM to start resilient, and APRL and AMBA to get resilient. And you have followed all the best practices and implemented recommendations. From April, you should leverage Azure policy for zone resiliency so you don't drift away from being resilient. Azure Zone Resiliency Policy contains about 34 Azure services today and still growing. You can implement this policy in audit mode if you prefer to just monitor, but it's better if you leverage the deny mode to avoid any unintended deployments. If you have leveraged recent version of ALZ or ALZ Accelerator, you already have these Azure Zone Resiliency policies implemented. All right, let's talk about some of the accelerated option with expert help and resources. We have solutions available to you. One is Azure Innovate and Azure Migrate and Modernize. These are the two offerings that can provide the support you need to accelerate Azure and AI adoption. Azure Innovate help you successfully infuse AI into your Azure-based solutions and improve your analytics capabilities to build innovative projects using Azure. And Azure Migrate and Modernize help you securely and efficiently move to Azure and modernize applications. If you are ready to begin an innovation and migration project, visit aka.ms/Azure offerings. Get started now. Both Azure Innovate and Azure Migrate and Modernize are backed up by foundational resources and best practices of Azure Essentials. Azure Essential help you elevate reliability, security, and performance of your cloud and AI investment. So if you want a skilled expert who have done these resiliency reviews a few times and have helped our customer in their resiliency journey, not just by leveraging APRL and EMBA, but more in-depth reviews like reviewing your RPO, RTO, reviewing disaster recovery, reviewing your SLA requirements, and if your current architecture going to meet that SLA you have in mind, and knows how to prioritize these recommendations for you and help give you a planning and implementing of architecture changes and share that in-depth knowledge with you, then reach out to us. We have great resources available for your help. We can have one of our expert CSA help you do an in-depth resiliency review for you, and at the end give you prioritize recommendations so you know what recommendations to tackle first and what can be your long-term goals. It really is a one-stop shop to get comprehensive set of resources, including tooling, skilling, guidance, reference architecture, and best practices. So Azure Essential Resource Kit includes all these multitude of links and Microsoft resources with an expert help for you. So you can get started for Azure Essential, use the link aka.ms/Azure Essentials. On behalf of Shirley and Saif, thank you for your time. Enjoy the rest of your presentation. Thank you.